Chapter 8 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I must go back. The tremendous plan for the salvation of their own suffering world through the chemist's discovery occupied the five friends for some time. Then, laying aside this subject that now had become of the most vital importance to them all, the chemist resumed his narrative. My last evening in the world of the ring I spent with Lylda, discussing our future and making plans for the journey. I must tell you now, gentlemen, that never for a moment during my stay in Arite was I once free from an awful dread of this return trip. I tried to conceive what it would be like, and the more I thought about it, the more hazardous it seemed. You must realize, when I was growing smaller coming in, I was able to climb down, or fall or slide down, into the spaces as they opened up. Going back, I could only imagine the world as closing in upon me, crushing me to death, unless I could find a larger space immediately above into which I could climb. As I talked with Lylda about this, and tried to make her understand what I hardly understood myself, I gradually was brought to the realization the full gravity of the danger confronting us. If only I had made the trip out once before, I could have ventured it with her, but as I looked at her fragile little body, to expose it to the terrible possibilities of such a journey was unthinkable. There was another question, too, that troubled me. I had been gone from you nearly a week, and you were only to wait for me 2 days. I believed firmly that I was living at a far faster rate, and that probably my time with you had not expired. But I did not know. And suppose, when I had come out on the surface of the ring, one of you had had it on his finger, walking along the street. No, I did not want Lylda with me in that event. And so I told her, made her understand that she must stay behind, and that I would come back for her. She did not protest. She said nothing, just looked up into my face with wide, staring eyes and a little quiver of her lips. Then she clutched my hand and fell into a low, sobbing cry. I held her in my arms for a few moments, so little, so delicate, so human in her sorrow, and yet almost superhuman in her radiant beauty. Soon she stopped crying and smiled up at me bravely. Next morning I left. Lylda took me through the tunnels and back into the forest by the river's edge where I had first met her. There we parted. I can see now her pathetic, drooping little figure as she trudged back to the tunnel. When she had disappeared, I sat down to plan out my journey. I resolved now to reverse as nearly as possible the steps I had taken coming in. Acting on this decision, I started back to that portion of the forest where I had trampled it down. I found the place without difficulty, stopping once on the way to eat a few berries and some of the food I carried with me. Then I took a small amount of one of the drugs, and in a few moments the forest trees had dwindled into tiny twigs beneath my feet. I started now to find the huge incline down which I had fallen, and when I reached it, after some hours of wandering, I followed its bottom edge to where a pile of rocks and dirt marked my former landing place. The rocks were much larger than I remembered them, and so I knew I was not so large now as when I was here before. Remembering the amount of the drug I had taken coming down, I took now 12 of the pills. Then, in a sudden panic, I hastily took 2 of the others. The result made my head swim most horribly. I sat or lay down, I forget which. When I looked up, I saw the hills beyond the river and forest coming toward me, yet dwindling away beneath my feet as they approached. The incline seemed folding up upon itself, like a telescope. As I watched, its upper edge came into view, a curved, luminous line against the blackness above. Every instant it crawled down closer, more sharply curved, and its inclined surface grew steeper. All this time, as I stood still, the ground beneath my feet seemed to be moving. It was crawling toward me and folding up underneath where I was standing. Frequently I had to move to avoid rocks that came at me and passed under my feet into nothingness. Then all at once I realized that I had been stepping constantly backward to avoid the inclined wall as it shoved itself toward me. I turned to see what was behind, and horror made my flesh creep at what I saw. A black, forbidding wall, much like the incline in front, entirely encircled me. It was hardly more than half a mile away, and towered 4,000 or 5,000 feet overhead. And as I stared in terror, I could see it closing in, the line of its upper edge coming steadily closer and lower. I looked wildly around with an overpowering impulse to run in every direction toward this rocky wall, inexorably swaying in to crush me. I think I fainted. When I came to myself, the scene had not greatly changed. I was lying at the bottom and against one wall of a circular pit, now about 1,000 feet in diameter and nearly twice as deep. The wall all around, I could see, was almost perpendicular, and it seemed impossible to ascend its smooth, shining sides. The action of the drug had evidently worn off, for everything was quite still. My fear had now left me, for I remembered this circular pit quite well. I walked over to its center, and looking around and up to its top, I estimated distances carefully. Then I took 2 more of the pills. Immediately the familiar, sickening, crawling sensation began again. As the walls closed in upon me, I kept carefully in the center of the pit. Steadily they crept in, now only a few hundred feet away, now only a few paces, and then I reached out and touched both sides at once with my hands. I tell you, gentlemen, it was a terrifying sensation to stand in that well, as it now seemed, and feel its walls closing up with irresistible force. But now the upper edge was within reach of my fingers. I leaped upward and hung for a moment, and then pulled myself up and scrabbled out, tumbling into a heap on the ground above. As I recovered myself, I looked again at the hole out of which I had escaped. It was hardly big enough to contain my fist. I knew now I was at the bottom of the scratch, but how different it looked than before. It seemed this time a long, narrow canyon, hardly more than 60 feet across. I glanced up and saw the blue sky overhead flooded with light. That, I knew, was the space of this room above the ring. The problem now was quite a different one than getting out of the pit, for I saw that the scratch was so deep in proportion to its width that if I let myself get too big I would be crushed by its walls before I could jump out. It would be necessary, therefore, to stay comparatively small and climb up its side. I selected what appeared to be an especially rough section and took a portion of another of the pills. Then I started to climb. After an hour the buskins on my feet were torn to fragments, and I was bruised and battered as you saw me. I see now how I could have made both the descent into the ring and my journey back with comparatively little effort, but I did the best I knew at the time. When the canyon was about 10 feet in width, and I had been climbing arduously for several hours, I found myself hardly more than 15 or 20 feet above its bottom, and I was still almost that far from the top. With the stature I had then attained, I could have climbed the remaining distance easily, but for the fact that the wall above had grown too smooth to afford a foothold. The effects of the drug had again worn off, and I sat down and prepared to take another dose. I did so, the smallest amount I could, and held ready in my hand a pill of the other kind in case of emergency. Steadily the walls closed in. A terrible feeling of dizziness now came over me. I clutched the rock beside which I was sitting, and it seemed to melt like ice beneath my grasp. Then I remembered seeing the edge of the canyon within reach above my head, and with my last remaining strength I pulled myself up and fell upon the surface of the ring. You know the rest. I took another dose of the powder, and in a few minutes was back among you." The Chemist stopped speaking and looked at his friends. "Well," he said, "you've heard it all. What do you think of it?" "It is a terrible thing to me," sighed the Very Young Man, "that you did not bring Lylda with you. It would have been a terrible thing if I had brought her, but I'm going back for her." "When do you plan to go back?" asked the Doctor after a moment. "As soon as I can. In a day or two," answered the Chemist. "Before you do your work here? You must not," remonstrated the Big Business Man. "Our war here needs you. Our nation, the whole cause of liberty and freedom needs you. You cannot go." "Lylda needs me too," returned the Chemist. "I have an obligation towards her now, you know, quite apart from my own feelings. Understand me, gentlemen," he continued earnestly. "I do not place myself and mine before the great fight for democracy and justice being waged in this world. That would be absurd. But it is not quite that way. Actually, I can go back for Lylda and return here in a week. That week will make little difference to the war. On the other hand, if I go to France first, it may take me a good many months to complete my task, and during that time Lylda will be using up her life several times faster than I. No, gentlemen, I am going to her first." "That week you propose to take," said the Banker slowly, "will cost this world thousands of lives that you could save. Have you thought of that?" The Chemist flushed. "I can recognize the salvation of a nation or a cause," he returned hotly, "but if I must choose between the lives of 1,000 men who are not dependent on me and the life or welfare of one woman who is, I shall choose the woman." "He's right, you know," said the Doctor, and the Very Young Man agreed with him fervently. 2 days later the company met again in the privacy of the club room. When they had finished dinner, the Chemist began in his usual quiet way. "I am going to ask you this time, gentlemen, to give me a full week. There are 4 of you, 6 hours a day of watching for each. It need not be too great a hardship, you see," he continued, as they nodded in agreement. "I want to spend a longer period in the ring world this time. I may never go back, and I want to learn, in the interest of science, as much about it as I can. I was there such a short time before, and it was all so strange and remarkable. I confess I learned practically nothing. I told you all I could of its history, but of its arts, its science, and all its sociological and economic questions I got hardly any more than a glimpse. It is a world and a people far less advanced than ours, yet with something we have not, and probably never will have, the universally distributed milk of human kindness. Yes, gentlemen, it is a world well worth studying." The Banker came out of a brown study. "How about your formulas for these drugs?" he asked abruptly. "Where are they?" The Chemist tapped his forehead smilingly. "Well, hadn't you better leave them with us?" the Banker pursued. "The hazards of your trip, you can't tell." "Don't misunderstand me, gentlemen," broke in the Chemist. "I wouldn't give you those formulas if my life and even Lylda's depended on it. There again you do not differentiate between the individual and the race. I know you 4 very well. You are my friends, with all the bond that friendship implies. I believe in your integrity, each of you, I trust implicitly. With these formulas you could crush Germany, or you could, any one of you, rule the world with all its treasures for your own. These drugs are the most powerful thing for good in the world today, but they are equally as powerful for evil. I would stake my life on what you would do, but I will not stake the life of a nation." "I know what I'd do if I had the formulas," began the Very Young Man. "Yes, but I don't know what you'd do," laughed the Chemist. "Don't you see I'm right?" They admitted that they did, though the Banker acquiesced very grudgingly. "The time of my departure is at hand. Is there anything else, gentlemen, before I leave you?" asked the Chemist, beginning to disrobe. "Please tell Lylda I want very much to meet her," said the Very Young Man earnestly, and they all laughed. When the room was cleared and the handkerchief and ring in place once more, the Chemist turned to them again. "Good bye, my friends," he said, holding out his hands. "1 week from tonight at most." Then he took the pills. No unusual incident marked his departure. The last they saw of him he was calmly sitting on the ring near the scratch. Then passed the slow days of watching, each taking his turn for the allotted 6 hours. By the 5th day they began to hourly expect the Chemist, but it passed through its weary length and he did not come. The 6th day dragged by, and then came the last. The day he had promised would end their watching. Still he did not come, and in the evening they gathered, and all 4 watched together, each unwilling to miss the return of the adventurer and his woman from another world. But the minutes lengthened into hours, and midnight found the white-faced little group hopeful yet hopeless, with fear tugging at their hearts. A second week passed, and still they watched, explaining with an optimism they could none of them feel the non-appearance of their friend. At the end of the second week they met again to talk the situation over, a dull feeling of fear and horror possessing them. The doctor was the first to voice what now each of them was forced to believe. "I guess it's all useless," he said. "He's not coming back." "I don't hardly dare give him up," said the Big Business Man. "Me too," agreed the Very Young Man sadly. The doctor sat for some time in silence, thoughtfully regarding the ring. "My friends," he began finally, "this is too big a thing to deal with in any but the most careful way. I can't imagine what is going on inside that ring, but I do know what is happening in our world, and what our friend's return means to civilization here. Under the circumstances, therefore, I cannot, I will not give him up. I am going to put that ring in a museum and pay for having it watched indefinitely. Will you join me?" He turned to the Big Business Man as he spoke. "Make it a threesome," said the Banker gruffly. "What do you take me for?" And the Very Young Man sighed with the tragedy of youth. End of chapter 8. Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After 5 years. 4 men sat in the clubroom at their ease in the luxurious leather chairs, smoking and talking earnestly. Near the center of the room stood a huge mahogany table. On its top, directly in the glare of light from an electrolier overhead, was spread a large black silk handkerchief. In the center of this handkerchief lay a heavy gold band, a woman's wedding ring. An old-fashioned valise stood near a corner of the table. Its sides were perforated with small brass-rimmed holes. Near the top, on one side, was a small square aperture covered with a wire mesh through which one might look into the interior. Altogether, from the outside, the bag looked much like those used for carrying small animals. As it lay on the table now, its top was partly open. The inside was brightly lighted by a small storage battery and electric globe fastened to the side. Near the bottom of the bag was a tiny wire rack, held suspended about an inch from the bottom by transverse wires to the sides. The inside of the bag was lined with black plush. On an arm of the doctor's chair lay 2 white tin boxes, 3 or 4 inches square. In his hand he held an opened envelope and several letter pages. "A little more than 5 years ago tonight, my friends," he began slowly, "we sat in this room with that," he indicated the ring, "under very different circumstances." After a moment he went on. "I think I am right when I say that for 5 years the thought uppermost in our minds has always been that ring and what is going on within one of its atoms." "You bet," said the Very Young Man. For 5 years now we have had that ring watched," continued the doctor, "but Rogers has never returned." "You asked us here tonight because you had something special to tell us," began the Very Young Man, with a questioning look at the valise and the ring. The doctor smiled. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't mean to be aggravating." "Go ahead in your own way, Frank," the Big Business Man put in. "We'll wait if we have to." The doctor glanced at the papers in his hand. He had just taken them from the envelope. "You are consumed with curiosity, naturally, to know what I have to say. Why I have brought this ring here tonight. Gentlemen, you have had to restrain that curiosity less than 5 minutes. I have had a far greater curiosity to endure and restrain for over 5 years. When Rogers left us on his last journey into the ring, he gave into my keeping, unknown to you, this envelope." The doctor held it up. "He made me swear I would keep its existence secret from every living being until the date marked upon it, at which time, in the event of his not having returned, it was to be opened. Look at it." The doctor laid the envelope on the table. "It is inscribed, as you see, 'To be opened by Dr. Frank Adams at 8 p.m. on September 4th, 1923.' For 5 years, gentlemen, I kept that envelope, knowing nothing of its contents, and waiting for the moment when I might, with honor, open it. The struggle has been a hard one. Many times I have almost been able to persuade myself, in justice to our friend's safety, to his very life probably, that it would be best to disregard his instructions. But I did not. I waited until the date set, and then, a little more than a month ago, alone in my office, I opened the envelope." The doctor leaned forward in his chair and shuffled the papers he held in his hand. His three friends sat tense, waiting. "The envelope contained these papers. Among them is a letter in which I am directed to explain everything to you as soon as I succeed in doing certain other things. Those things I have now accomplished. So I have sent for you. I'll read you the letter first." No one spoke when the doctor paused. The banker drew a long breath. Then he bit off the end of a fresh cigar and lit it with a shaking hand. The doctor shifted his chair closer to the table under the light. "The letter is dated September 14th, 1918. It begins: 'This will be read at 8 p.m. on September 4th, 1923, by Dr. Frank Adams, with no one else present. If the envelope has been opened by him previous to that date, I request him to read no further. If it has fallen into other hands than his, I can only hope that the reader will immediately destroy it unread.'" The doctor paused an instant and then went on: "Gentlemen, we are approaching the most important events of our lives. An extraordinary duty, a tremendous responsibility rests with us. Of all the millions of people on this earth, I ask that you listen most carefully." His admonition was quite unnecessary, for no one could have been more intent than the three men silently facing him. The doctor continued reading. "From Dr. Frank Adams. I exact the following oath. Before he reads further, you, Dr. Adams, will divulge to no one for a period of 30 days the formulas set down in these papers. You will follow implicitly the directions given you. You will do nothing that is not expressly stated here. Should you be unable to carry out these directions, you will destroy this letter and the formulas, and tell no one of their ever having been in existence. I must have your oath, Dr. Adams, before you proceed further." The doctor's voice died away, and he laid the papers on the table. "Gentlemen," he went on, "later on in the letter I am directed to consult with you three, setting before you this whole matter. But before I do so, I must exact a similar oath from each of you. I must have your word of honor, gentlemen, that you will not attempt to transgress the instructions given us, and that you will never, by word or action, allow a suggestion of what passes between us here in this room tonight to reach any other person. Have I your promise?" Each of his three hearers found voice to agree. The banker's face was very red, and he mopped his forehead nervously with his handkerchief. The doctor picked up the papers. The letter goes on. I am about to venture back into the unknown world of the ring. What will befall me there I cannot foretell. If by September 4th, 1923, I have not returned, or no other mortal has come out of the ring, it is my desire that you and the three gentlemen with you at the time of my departure use this discovery of mine for the benefit of humanity in your world, or the world in the ring, exactly as I myself would have used it if I were there. Should the European war be in progress at that time, I direct that you four throw your power on the side of the United States for the defeat of the Central Powers. That you will be able to accomplish that defeat, I cannot doubt. If on September 4th, 1923, the United States is formally at peace with the powers of the world, you are forbidden to use these chemicals for any purpose other than joining me in the world of the ring. If any among you wish to make the venture, which I hope may be the case, I request that you do so. Among these pages you will find a list of 14 chemicals to be used by Dr. Frank Adams during the month following September 4th, 1923, for the compounding of my powders. 7 of these chemicals, marked A, are employed in the drug used to diminish bodily size. Those 7 marked B are for the drug of opposite action. You will find here a separate description of each chemical. 9 are well known and fairly common. Dr. Adams will be able to purchase each of them separately without difficulty. 3 others will have to be especially compounded, and I have so stated in the directions for each of them. Dr. Adams can have them prepared by any large chemical manufacturer. I suggest that he have not more than one of them compounded by the same company. The 2 remaining chemicals must be prepared by Dr. Adams personally. Their preparation, while intricate, demands no complicated or extensive apparatus. I have tried to explain thoroughly the making of these 2 chemicals, and I believe no insurmountable obstacle will be met in completing them. When Dr. Adams has the specified quantities of each of these 14 chemicals in his possession, he will proceed according to my further directions to compound the 2 drugs. If he is successful in making these drugs, I direct that he make known to the 3 other men referred to the contents of this letter, after first exacting an oath from each that its provisions will be carried out. I think it probable that Dr. Adams will succeed in compounding these 2 drugs. It also seems probable that at that time the United States will no longer be at war. I make the additional assumption that 1 or more of you gentlemen will desire to join me in the ring. Therefore, you find herewith memoranda of my first journey into the ring, which I have already described to you. I give also the quantities of each drug to be taken at various stages of the trip. These notes will refresh your memory and will assist you in your journey. I intend to suggest to Dr. Adams today, when I hand him this letter, that in the event of my failure to return within a week, he make some adequate provision for guarding the ring in safety. And I must caution you now, before starting to join me, if you conclude to do so, that you continue this provision, so as to make possible your safe return to your own world. If our country is at war at the time you read this, your duty is plain. I have no fears regarding your course of action. But if not, I do not care to influence unduly your decision about venturing into this unknown other world. The danger into which I personally may have fallen must count for little with you in a decision to hazard your own lives. I may point out, however, that such a journey successfully accomplished cannot fail but be the greatest contribution to science that has ever been made. Nor can I doubt but that your coming may prove of tremendous benefit to the humanity of this other equally important, though in our eyes infinitesimal world. I therefore suggest, gentlemen, that you start your journey into the ring at 8 p.m. on the evening of November 4th, 1923. You will do your best to find your way directly to the city of Arite, where, if I am alive, I will be awaiting you. End of chapter 9. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Testing the drugs. The doctor laid his papers on the table and looked up into the white faces of the three men facing him. "That's all, gentlemen," he said. For a moment no one spoke, and on the face of each was plainly written the evidence of an emotion too deep for words. The doctor sorted out the papers in silence, glanced over them for a moment, and then reached for a large metal ashtray that stood near him on the table. Taking a match from his pocket, he calmly lighted a corner of the papers and dropped them burning into the metal bowl. His friends watched him in awed silence. Only the Very Young Man found words to protest. "Say now, wait," he began. "Why?" The doctor looked at him. "The letter requests me to do that," he said. "But I say the formulas," persisted the Very Young Man, looking wildly at the burning papers. The doctor held up one of the white tin boxes lying on the arm of his chair. "In these tins," he said, "I have vials containing the specified quantity of each drug. It is ample for our purpose. I have done my best to memorize the formulas, but in any event I was directed to burn them at the time of reading you the letter. I have done so." The Big Business Man came out of a brown study. "Just 3 weeks from tonight," he murmured. "3 weeks from tonight. It's too big to realize." The doctor put the 2 boxes on the table, turned his chair back toward the others, and lighted a cigar. "Gentlemen, let's go over this matter thoroughly," he began. "We have a momentous decision to make. Either we destroy those boxes and their contents, or 3 weeks from tonight some or all of us start our journey into the ring. I have had a month to think this matter over. I have made my decision. I know there is much for you to consider before you can each of you choose your own course of action. It is not my desire or intention to influence you one way or the other, but we can, if you wish, discuss the matter here tonight, or we can wait, if you prefer, until each of you has had time to think it out for himself." "I am going," the Very Young Man burst out. His hands were gripping the arms of his chair tightly. His face was very pale, but his eyes sparkled. The doctor turned to him gravely. "Your life is at stake, my boy," he said. "This is not a matter for impulse." "I'm going whether anyone else does or not," persisted the Very Young Man. "You can't stop me, either," he added doggedly. "The letter said—" The doctor smiled at the youth's earnestness. Then abruptly he held out his hand. "There is no use in my holding back my own decision. I am going to attempt the trip. And since, as you say, I cannot stop you from going," he added with a twinkle, "that makes 2 of us." They shook hands. The Very Young Man lighted a cigarette and began pacing up and down the room, staring hard at the floor. "I can remember trying to imagine how I would feel," began the Big Business Man slowly, "if Rogers had asked me to go with him when he first went into the ring. It is not a new idea to me, for I've thought about it many times in the abstract during the past 5 years, but now that I'm face to face with it in reality, it's sort of—" He broke off and smiled helplessly around at his companions. The Very Young Man stopped in his walk. "Aw, come on in," he began. "Shut up," growled the Banker, speaking for the first time in many minutes. "I'm sure we would all like to go," said the doctor. "The point is, which of us are best fitted for the trip?" "None of us are married," put in the Very Young Man. "I've been thinking," began the Banker. "Suppose we get into the ring, how long would we be gone, do you suppose?" "Who can say?" answered the doctor, smiling. "Perhaps a month, a year, many years possibly. That is one of the hazards of the venture." The Banker went on thoughtfully. Do you remember that argument we had with Rogers about time? Time goes twice as fast, didn't he say, in that other world? 2.5 times faster, if I remember rightly, he estimated, replied the doctor. The banker looked at his skinny hands a moment. I owned up to 64 once, he said quizzically. 2.5 years in 1 year. No, I guess I'll let you young fellows tackle that. I'll stay here in this world where things don't move so fast. Somebody's got to stay, said the Very Young Man. By golly, you know if we're all going into that ring, it would be pretty sad to have anything happen to it while we were gone. That's so, said the banker, looking relieved. I never thought of that. One of us should stay at least, said the doctor. We cannot take any outsider into our confidence. One of us must watch the others go, and then take the ring back to its place in the museum. We will be gone too long a time for one person to watch it here. The Very Young Man suddenly went to one of the doors and locked it. We don't want anyone coming in, he explained, as he crossed the room and locked the others. Another thing, he went on, coming back to the table. When I saw the ring at the Biological Society the other day, I happened to think, suppose Rogers was to come out on the underneath side. It was lying flat, you know, just as it is now. He pointed to where the ring lay on the handkerchief before them. I meant to speak to you about it, he added. I thought of that, said the doctor. When I had that case built to bring the ring here, you notice I raised it above the bottom a little, holding it suspended in that wire frame. We'd better fix up something like that at the museum, too, said the Very Young Man, and went back to his walk. The Big Business Man had been busily jotting down figures on the back of an envelope. I can be in shape to go in 3 weeks, he said suddenly. Bully for you, said the Very Young Man. Then it's all settled. The Big Business Man went back to his notes. I knew what your answer would be, said the doctor. My patients can go to the devil. This is too big a thing. The Very Young Man picked up one of the tin boxes. Tell us how you made the powders, he suggested. The doctor took the 2 boxes and opened them. Inside each were a number of tiny glass vials. Those in one box were of blue glass, those in the other were red. These vials, said the doctor, contain tiny pellets of the completed drug. That for diminishing size I have put in the red vials. Those of blue are the other drug. I had rather a difficult time making them, that is, compared to what I anticipated. Most of the chemicals I bought without difficulty, but when I came to compound those 2 myself, the doctor smiled. I used to think I was a fair chemist in my student days, but now, well, at least I got the results, but only because I have been working almost night and day for the past month. I found myself with a remarkably complete experimental laboratory when I finished, he added. That was yesterday. I spent nearly all last night destroying the apparatus as soon as I found that the drugs had been properly made. They do work? Said the Very Young Man anxiously. They work, answered the doctor. I tried them both very carefully. On yourself? Said the Big Business Man. No, I didn't think that necessary. I used several insects. Let's try them now, suggested the Very Young Man eagerly. Not the big one, said the banker. Once was enough for that. All right, the doctor laughed. We'll try the other if you like. The Big Business Man looked around the room. There are a few flies around here if we can catch one, he suggested. I'll bet there's a cockroach in the kitchen, said the Very Young Man, jumping up. The doctor took a brass check from his pocket. I thought probably you'd want to try them out. Will you get that box from the check room? He handed the check to the Very Young Man, who hurried out of the room. He returned in a moment, gingerly carrying a cardboard box with holes perforated in the top. The doctor took the box and lifted the lid carefully. Inside the box was partitioned into 2 compartments. In one compartment were 3 little lizards about 4 inches long. In the other were 2 brown sparrows. The doctor took out one of the sparrows and replaced the cover. Fine, said the Very Young Man with enthusiasm. The doctor reached for the boxes of chemicals. "Not the big one," said the banker again, apprehensively. "Hold him, will you?" the doctor said. The Very Young Man took the sparrow in his hands. "Now," continued the doctor, "what we need is a plate and a little water." "There's a tray," said the Very Young Man, pointing with his hands holding the sparrow. The doctor took a spoon from the tray and put a little water in it. Then he took one of the tiny pellets from a red vial, and crushing it in his fingers, sprinkled a few grains into that water. "Hold that a moment, please." The Big Business Man took the proffered spoon. Then the doctor produced from his pocket a magnifying glass and a tiny pair of silver calipers, such as are used by jewelers for handling small objects. "What's the idea?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. "I thought I'd try to put him on the ring," explained the doctor. "Now then, hold open his beak." The Very Young Man did so, and the doctor poured the water down the bird's throat, most of it spilled. The sparrow twisted its head violently, but evidently some of the liquid had gone down the bird's throat. Silence followed, broken after a moment by the scared voice of the Very Young Man. "He's getting smaller. I can feel him. He's getting smaller." "Hold on to him," cautioned the doctor. "Bring him over here." They went over to the table by the ring, the banker and the Big Business Man standing close beside them. "Suppose he tries to fly when we let go of him," suggested the Very Young Man, almost in a whisper. "He'll probably be too confused," answered the doctor. "Have you got him?" The sparrow was hardly bigger than a large horsefly now, and the Very Young Man was holding it between his thumb and forefinger. "Better give him to me," said the doctor. "Set him down." "He might fly away," remonstrated the Very Young Man. "No, he won't." The Very Young Man put the sparrow on the handkerchief beside the ring, and the doctor immediately picked it up with the calipers. "Don't squeeze him," cautioned the Very Young Man. The sparrow grew steadily smaller, and in a moment the doctor set it carefully on the rim of the ring. "Get him up by the scratch," whispered the Very Young Man. The men bent closer over the table as the doctor, looking through his magnifying glass, shoved the sparrow slowly along the top of the ring. "I can't see him," said the banker. "I can," said the Very Young Man, "right by the scratch." Then, after a moment, "He's gone." "I got him right over the scratch," said the doctor, leaning farther down. Then he raised his head and laid the magnifying glass and the calipers on the table. "He's gone now." "Gosh," said the Very Young Man, drawing a long breath. The banker flung himself into a chair as though exhausted from a great physical effort. "Well, it certainly does work," said the Big Business Man. "There's no question about that." The Very Young Man was shaking the cardboard box in his hands and lifting its cover cautiously to see inside. "Let's try a lizard," he suggested. "Oh, what's the use?" the banker protested wearily. "We know it works." "Well, it can't hurt anything to try it, can it?" the Very Young Man urged. "Besides, the more we try it, the more sure we are it will work with us when the time comes. You don't want to try it on yourself now, do you?" he added with a grin. "No, thank you," retorted the banker with emphasis. "I think we might as well try it again," said the Big Business Man. The Very Young Man took one of the tiny lizards from the box, and in a moment they had dropped some water containing the drug down its throat. "Try to put him on the scratch, too," said the Very Young Man. When the lizard was small enough, the doctor held it with the calipers and then laid it on the ring. "Look at him walk! Look at him walk!" whispered the Very Young Man excitedly. The lizard, hardly more than an eighth of an inch long now, but still plainly visible, was wriggling along the top of the ring. "Shove him up by the scratch," he added. In a moment more the reptile was too small for any but the doctor with his glass to see. "I guess he got there," he said finally with a smile as he straightened up. "He was going fast." "Well, that's all right," said the Very Young Man with a sigh of relief. The four men again seated themselves. The Big Business Man went back to his figures. "When do you start?" asked the banker after a moment. "November 4th, 8 p.m.," answered the doctor. "3 weeks from tonight." "We've a lot to do," said the Banker. "What will this cost, do you figure?" asked the Big Business Man, looking up from his notes. The Doctor considered for a moment. "We can't take much with us, you know," he said slowly. Then he took a sheet of memoranda from his pockets. "I've already spent for apparatus and chemicals to prepare the drugs," he consulted his figures, $1,740 total. What we have still to spend will be very little, I should think. I propose we divide it 3 ways, as we have been doing with the museum. 4 ways," said the Very Young Man. "I'm no kid any more. I got a good job, that is," he added with a rueful air. "I had a good job. Tomorrow I quit." 4 ways, the Doctor corrected himself gravely. "I guess we can manage that." "What can we take with us, do you think?" asked the Big Business Man. "I should think we should try strapping a belt around our waists with pouches in it," said the Doctor. "I doubt if it would contract with our bodies, but still it might. If it didn't, there would be no harm done. We could leave it behind." "You want food and water," said the Banker. "Remember that barren country you are going through." "And something on our feet," the Big Business Man put in. "I'd like to take a revolver, too," said the Very Young Man. "It might come in awful handy." "As I remember Roger's description," said the Doctor thoughtfully, "the trip out is more difficult than going down. We mustn't overlook preparations for that. It is most imperative we should be careful." "Say, talking about getting back," burst out the Very Young Man, "I'd like to see that other drug work first. It would be pretty rotten to get in there and have it go back on us, wouldn't it? Oh, golly!" The Very Young Man sank back into his chair, overcome by the picture he had conjured up. "I tried it," said the Doctor. "It works." "I'd like to see it again with something different," said the Big Business Man. "It can't do any harm." The Banker looked his protest, but said nothing. "What shall we try, a lizard?" suggested the Very Young Man. The Doctor shrugged his shoulders. "What will we kill it with? Oh, I know." The Very Young Man picked up a heavy metal paperweight from the desk. "This'll do the trick fine," he added. Then, laying the paperweight carefully aside, he dipped up a spoonful of water and offered it to the Doctor. "Not that water this time," said the Doctor, shaking his head with a smile. The Very Young Man looked blank. "Organisms in it," the Doctor explained briefly. "All right for them to get small from the other chemical, but we don't want them to get large and come out at us, do we?" "Holy smoke, I should say not," said the Very Young Man, gasping, and the Banker growled, "Something's going to happen to us playing with fire like this." The Doctor produced a little bottle. "I boiled this water," he said. "We can use this." It took but a moment to give the other drug to one of the remaining lizards, although they spilled more of the water than went down its throat. "Don't forget to hit him, and don't wait very long," said the Banker warningly, moving nearer the door. "Oh, I'll hit him all right, don't worry," said the Very Young Man, brandishing the paperweight. The Doctor knelt down and held the reptile pinned to the floor. The Very Young Man knelt beside him. Slowly the lizard began to increase in size. "He's growing," said the Banker. "Hit him, boy. What's the use of waiting? He's growing." The lizard was nearly a foot long now, and struggling violently between the Doctor's fingers. "You'd better kill him," said the Doctor. "He might get away from me." The Very Young Man obediently brought his weapon down with a thump upon the reptile's head. "Keep on," said the Banker. "Be sure he's dead." The Very Young Man pounded the quivering body for a moment. The Big Business Man handed him a napkin from the tray, and the Very Young Man wrapped up the lizard and threw it into the wastebasket. Then he rose to his feet and tossed the paperweight onto the desk with a crash. "Well, gentlemen," he said, turning back to him with a flushed face, "those drugs sure do work. We're going into the ring all right, 3 weeks from tonight, and nothing on earth can stop us." End of chapter 10. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The escape of the drug. For the next hour the four friends busily planned their preparations for the journey. When they began to discuss the details of the trip, and found themselves face to face with so hazardous an adventure, each discovered 100 things in his private life that needed attention. The doctor's phrase, "My patients can go to the devil," seemed to relieve his mind of all further responsibility towards his personal affairs. "That's all very well for you," said the Big Business Man. "I've too many irons in the fire just to drop everything. There are too many other people concerned, and I've got to plan as though I were never coming back, you know." "Your troubles are easy," said the Very Young Man. "I've got a girl. I wonder what she'll say. Oh, gosh, I can't tell her where I'm going, can I? I never thought of that." He scratched his head with a perplexed air. "That's tough on her. Well, I'm glad I'm an orphan, anyway." The actual necessities of the trip needed a little discussion, for what they could take with them amounted to practically nothing. "As I understand it," said the Banker, "all I have to do is watch you start, and then take the ring back to the museum." "Take it carefully," continued the Very Young Man. "Remember what it's got in it." "You will give us about 2 hours to get well started down," said the Doctor. "After that it will be quite safe to move the ring. You can take it back to the society in that case I brought it here in." "Be sure you take it yourself," put in the Very Young Man. "Don't trust it to anybody else. And how about having that wire rack fixed for it at the museum?" he added. "Don't forget that." "I'll have done that myself this week," said the Doctor. They had been talking for perhaps an hour when the Banker got up from his chair to get a fresh cigar from a box that lay upon the desk. He happened to glance across the room, and on the floor in the corner by the closed door he saw a long, flat object that had not been there before. It was out of the circle of light, and being brown against the polished hardwood floor, he could not make it out clearly, but something about it frightened him. "What's that over there?" he asked, standing still and pointing. The Big Business Man rose from his seat and took a few steps in the direction of the Banker's outstretched hand. Then, with a muttered oath, he jumped to the desk in a panic, and picking up the heavy paperweight, flung it violently across the room. It struck the paneled wall with a crash and bounded back towards him. At the same instant there came a scuttling sound from the floor, and a brown shape slid down the edge of the room and stopped in the other corner. All four men were on their feet in an instant, white-faced and trembling. "Good God!" said the Big Business Man huskily. "That thing over there, that—" "Turn on the side lights, the side lights!" shouted the Doctor, running across the room. In the glare of the unshaded globes on the wall, the room was brightly lighted. On the floor in the corner the horrified men saw a cockroach nearly 18 inches in length, with its head facing the angle of wall and scratching with its legs against the baseboard as though about to climb up. For a moment the men stood silent with surprise and terror. Then, as they stared, they saw the cockroach was getting larger. The Big Business Man laid his hand on the Doctor's arm with a grip that made the Doctor wince. "Good God, man, look at it! It's growing," he said in a voice hardly above a whisper. "It's growing," echoed the Very Young Man. "It's growing." And then the truth dawned upon them, and brought with it confusion, almost panic. The cockroach, fully 2 feet long now, had raised the front end of its body a foot above the floor and was reaching up the wall with its legs. The Banker made a dash for the opposite door. "Let's get out of here! Come on!" he shouted. The Doctor stopped him. Of the four men he was the only one who had retained his self-possession. "Listen to me," he said. His voice trembled a little in spite of his efforts to control it. "Listen to me. That thing cannot harm us yet." He looked from one to the other of them and spoke swiftly. "It's gruesome and loathsome, but it is not dangerous yet. But we cannot run from it. We must kill it here, now, before it gets any larger." The Banker tore himself loose and started again towards the door. "You fool," said the Doctor with a withering look. "Don't you see? It's life or death later. That thing will be as big as this house in half an hour. Don't you know that? As big as this house. We've got to kill it now. Now!" The Big Business Man ran towards the paperweight. "I'll hit it with this," he said. "You can't," said the Doctor. "You might miss. We haven't time. Look at it," he added. The cockroach was noticeably larger now. Considerably over 2 feet, it had turned away from the wall to face them. The Very Young Man had said nothing, only stood and stared with bloodless face and wide open eyes. Then suddenly he stooped, and picking up a small rug from the floor, a rug some 6 feet long and half as wide, advanced slowly towards the cockroach. "That's the idea," encouraged the Doctor. "Get it under that. Here, give me part of it." He grasped a corner of the rug. "You two go up the other sides," he pointed with his free hand, "and head it off if it runs." Slowly the four men crept forward. The cockroach, 3 feet long now, was a hideous, horrible object as it stood backed into the corner of the room, the front part of its body swaying slowly from side to side. "We'd better make a dash for it," whispered the Very Young Man, and jerking the rug loose from the Doctor's grasp, he leaped forward and flung himself headlong upon the floor with the rug completely under him. "I got the damned thing! I got it!" he shouted. "Help! You help!" The three men leaped with him upon the rug, holding it pinned to the floor. The Very Young Man, as he lay, could feel the curve of the great body underneath, and could hear the scratch of its many legs upon the floor. "Hold down the edges of the rug!" he cried. "Don't let it out! Don't let it get out! I'll smash it!" He raised himself on his hands and knees and came down heavily. The rug gave under his thrust as the insect flattened out. Then they could hear again the muffled scratching of its legs upon the floor as it raised the rug up under the Very Young Man's weight. "We can't kill it," panted the Big Business Man. "Oh, we can't kill it. Good God, how big it is!" The Very Young Man got to his feet and stood on the bulge of the rug. Then he jumped into the air and landed solidly on his heels. There was a sharp crack as the shell of the insect broke under the sharpness of his blow. "That did it! That'll do it!" he shouted. Then he leaped again. "Let me," said the Big Business Man. "I'm heavier." And he, too, stamped upon the rug with his heels. They could hear the huge shell of the insect's back smash under his weight, and when he jumped again, the squash of its body as he mashed it down. "Wait," said the Doctor. "We've killed it." They eased up upon the rug a little, but there was no movement from beneath. "Jump on it harder," said the Very Young Man. "Don't let's take a chance. Mash it good." The Big Business Man continued stamping violently upon the rug, joined now by the Very Young Man. The Doctor sat on the floor beside it, breathing heavily. The Banker lay in a heap at its foot in utter collapse. As they stamped, the rug continued to flatten down. It sank under their tread with a horrible, sickening, squashing sound. "Let's look," suggested the Very Young Man. "It must be dead." And he threw back a corner of the rug. The men turned sick and faint at what they saw. Underneath the rug, mashed against the floor, lay a great, noisome, semi-liquid mass of brown and white. It covered nearly the entire under surface of the rug, 100 pounds perhaps, of loathsome pulp and shell, from which a stench arose that stopped their breathing. With a muttered imprecation, the Doctor flung back the rug to cover it, and sprang to his feet, steadying himself against a chair. "We killed it in time, thank God," he muttered, and dropped into the chair, burying his face in his hands. For a time silence fell upon the room, broken only by the labored breathing of the four men. Then the Big Business Man sat up suddenly. "Oh, my God, what an experience!" he groaned, as he got unsteadily to his feet. The Very Young Man helped the Banker up and led him to a seat by the window, which he opened, letting in the fresh, cool air of the night. "How did that drug get loose, do you suppose?" asked the Very Young Man, coming back to the center of the room. He had recovered his composure somewhat, though he was still very pale. He lighted a cigarette and sat down beside the Doctor. The Doctor raised his head wearily. "I suppose we must have spilled some of it on the floor," he said. "And the cockroach—" He stopped abruptly and sprang to his feet. "Good God!" he cried. "Suppose another one—" On the bare floor beside the table they came upon a few drops of water. "That must be it," said the Doctor. He pulled his handkerchief from his pocket, then stopped in thought. "No, that won't do. What shall we do with it?" he added. "We must destroy it absolutely. Good Lord, if that drug ever gets loose upon the world—" The Big Business Man joined them. "We must destroy it absolutely," repeated the Doctor. "We just can't wipe it up." "Some acid," suggested the Big Business Man. "Suppose something else has got at it already," the Very Young Man said in a scared voice, and began hastily looking around the floor of the room. "You're right," agreed the Doctor. "We mustn't take any chance. We must look thoroughly." Joined by the Banker, the four men began carefully going over the room. "You'd better watch that nothing gets at it," the Very Young Man thought suddenly to say. The Banker obediently sat down by the little pool of water on the floor. "And I'll close the window," added the Very Young Man. "Something might get out." They searched the room thoroughly, carefully scanning its walls and ceiling, but could see nothing out of the ordinary. "We'll never be quite sure," said the Doctor finally, "but I guess we're safe. It's the best we can do now, at any rate." He joined the Banker by the table. "I'll get some nitric acid," he added. "I don't know what else—" "We'll have to get that out of here, too," said the Big Business Man, pointing to the rug. "God knows how we'll explain it." The Doctor picked up one of the tin boxes of drugs and held it in his hand meditatively. Then he looked over towards the rug. From under one side a brownish liquid was oozing. The Doctor shuddered. "My friends," he said, holding up the box before them, "we can realize now something of the terrible power we have created and imprisoned here. We must guard it carefully, gentlemen, for if it escapes it will destroy the world." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Start. On the evening of November 4th, 1923, the four friends again assembled at the Scientific Club for the start of their momentous adventure. The Doctor was the last to arrive, and found the other three anxiously awaiting him. He brought with him the valise containing the ring and a suitcase with the drugs and equipment necessary for the journey. He greeted his friends gravely. "The time has come, gentlemen," he said, putting the suitcase on the table. The Big Business Man took out the ring and held it in his hand thoughtfully. "The scene of our new life," he said with emotion. "What does it hold in store for us?" "What time is it?" asked the Very Young Man. "We've got to hurry. We want to get started on time. We mustn't be late." "Everything's ready, isn't it?" asked the Banker. "Who has the belts?" "They're in my suitcase," answered the Very Young Man. "There it is." The Doctor laid the ring and handkerchief on the floor under the light and began unpacking from his bag the drugs and the few small articles they had decided to try and take with them. "You have the food and water?" he said. The Big Business Man produced 3 small flasks of water and 6 flat, square tins containing compressed food. The Very Young Man opened one of them. "Chocolate soldiers we are," he said, and laughed. The Banker was visibly nervous and just a little frightened. "Are you sure you haven't forgotten something?" he asked quaveringly. "It wouldn't make a great deal of difference if we had," said the Doctor with a smile. "The belts may not contract with us at all. We may have to leave them behind." "Rogers didn't take anything," put in the Very Young Man. "Come on, let's get undressed." The banker locked the doors and sat down to watch the men make their last preparations. They spoke little while they were disrobing. The solemnity of what they were about to do both awed and frightened them. Only the Very Young Man seemed exhilarated by the excitement of the coming adventure. In a few moments the three men were dressed in their white woolen bathing suits. The Very Young Man was the first to be fully equipped. "I'm ready," he announced. "All but the chemicals. Where are they?" Around his waist he had strapped a broad cloth belt with a number of pockets fastened to it. On his feet were felt-lined cloth shoes with hard rubber soles. He wore a wrist watch. Under each armpit was fastened a pouch for carrying the drugs. "Left arm for red vials," said the Doctor. "Be sure of that. We mustn't get them mixed. Take 2 of each color." He handed the Very Young Man the tin boxes. All the men were ready in a moment more. 5 minutes of 8, said the Very Young Man, looking at his watch. "We're right on time. Let's get started." The Banker stood up among them. "Tell me what I've got to do," he said helplessly. "You're going all but me. I'll be left behind alone." The Big Business Man laid his hand on the Banker's shoulder affectionately. "Don't look so sad, George," he said, with an attempt at levity. "We're not leaving you forever. We're coming back." The Banker pressed his friend's hand. His usual crusty manner was quite gone now. He seemed years older. The Doctor produced the same spoon he had used when the Chemist made his departure into the ring. "I've kept it all this time," he said, smiling. "Perhaps it will bring us luck." He handed it to the Banker. "What you have to do is this," he continued seriously. "We shall all take an equal amount of the drugs at the same instant. I hope it will act upon each of us at the same rate, so that we may diminish uniformly in size and thus keep together." "Gosh," said the Very Young Man, "I never thought of that. Suppose it doesn't?" "Then we shall have to adjust the difference by taking other smaller amounts of the drug, but I think probably it will. You must be ready," he went on to the Banker, "to help us on to the ring if necessary." "Or put us back if we fall off," said the Very Young Man. "I'm going to sit still until I'm pretty small. Gracious, it's going to feel funny." "After we have disappeared," continued the Doctor, "you will wait, say until 11 o'clock. Watch the ring carefully. Some of us may have to come back before that time. At 11 o'clock pack up everything." He looked around the littered room with a smile, "and take the ring back to the Biological Society." "Keep your eye on it on the way back," warned the Very Young Man. "Suppose we decide to come out some time later tonight. You can't tell." "I'll watch it all night tonight, here and at the Museum," said the Banker, mopping his forehead. "Good scheme," said the Very Young Man approvingly. "Anything might happen." "Well, gentlemen," said the Doctor, "I believe we're all ready. Come on, Will." The Big Business Man was standing by the window, looking out intently. He evidently did not hear the remark addressed to him, for he paid no attention. The Doctor joined him. Through the window they could see the street below, crowded now with scurrying automobiles. The sidewalks were thronged with people, theater goers, hurrying forward, seeking eagerly their evening's pleasure. It had been raining, and the wet pavements shone with long, blurred, yellow glints from the thousands of lights above. Down the street they could see a huge blazing theater sign with the name of a popular actress spelt in letters of fire. The Big Business Man threw up the window sash and took a deep breath of the moist, cool air of the night. "Good bye, old world," he murmured with emotion. "Shall I see you again, I wonder?" He stood for a moment longer, silently staring at the scene before him. Then abruptly he closed the window, pulled down the shade, and turned back to the room. "Come on," said the Very Young Man impatiently. "It's 5 minutes after 8. Let's get started." "Just one thing before we start," said the Doctor,
as they gathered in the center of the room. "We must understand, gentlemen, from the moment we first take the drug until we reach our final smallest size, it is imperative, or at least highly desirable, that we keep together. We start by taking 4 of the pellets each, according to the memoranda Rogers left. By Jove," he interrupted himself, "that's one thing important we did nearly forget." He went to his coat and from his wallet took several typewritten sheets of paper. "I made 3 copies," he said, handing them to his companions. "Put them away carefully. The front pocket will be most convenient, probably." "It may not be hard for us to keep together," continued the Doctor. "On the other hand, we may find it extremely difficult, if not quite impossible. In the latter event, we will meet at the city of Arite. There are 2 things we must consider. First, we shall be constantly changing size with relation to our surroundings. In proportion to each other, we must remain normal in size if we can. Secondly, we shall be traveling, changing position in our surroundings. So far as that aspect of the trip is concerned, it will not be more difficult for us to keep together, probably, than during any adventurous journey here in this world. If through accident or any unforeseen circumstance we are separated in size, the one being smallest shall wait for the others. That can be accomplished by taking a very small quantity of the other drug, probably merely touching one of the pellets to the tongue. Do I make myself clear?" His friends nodded assent. "If any great separation in relative size occurs," the Doctor went on, "a discrepancy sufficient to make the smallest of us invisible for a time to the others, then another problem presents itself. We must be very careful in that event not to change our position in space, not to keep on traveling, in other words, or else, when we become the same size once more, we will be out of sight of one another, geographically separated, so to speak." The Doctor finished with a smile. "I am so explicit on this point of keeping together," he continued, "because, well, I personally do not want to undertake even part of this journey alone." "You're darn right. Me neither," agreed the Very Young Man emphatically. "Let's get going." "I guess that's all," said the Doctor with a last glance around, and finally facing the Banker. "Good bye, George." The Banker was quite overcome, and without a word he shook hands with each of his friends. The 3 men sat beside each other on the floor, close to the handkerchief and ring. The Banker sat in his chair on the other side, facing them, spoon in hand. In silence they each took 4 of the pellets. Then the Banker saw them close their eyes. He saw the Big Business Man put his hand suddenly on the floor as though to steady himself. The Banker gripped the arms of his chair firmly. He knew exactly what to expect, yet now, when his friends began slowly to diminish in size, he was filled with surprise and horror. For several minutes no one spoke. Then the Very Young Man opened his eyes, looked around dizzily for an instant, and began feeling with his hands the belt at his waist, his shoes, wrist watch, and the pouches under his armpits. "It's all right," he said with an enthusiasm that contrasted strangely with the tremor in his voice. "The belt's getting smaller, too. We're going to be able to take everything with us." Again silence fell on the room, broken only by the sound of the 3 men on the floor continually shifting their positions as they grew smaller. In another moment the Doctor clambered unsteadily to his feet and, taking a step backward, leaned up against the cylindrical mahogany leg of the center table, flinging his arms around it. His head did not reach the top of the table. The Very Young Man and the Big Business Man were on their feet now, too, standing at the edge of the handkerchief and clinging to one another for support. The Banker looked down at them and tried to smile. The Very Young Man waved his hand, and the Banker found voice to say, "Good bye, my boy." "Good bye, sir," echoed the Very Young Man. "We're making it." Steadily they grew smaller. By this time the Doctor had become far too small for his arms to encircle the leg of the table. The Banker looked down to the floor and saw him standing beside the table leg, leaning one hand against it as one would lean against the great stone column of some huge building. "Good by, Frank," said the Banker, but the Doctor did not answer. He seemed lost in thought. Several minutes more passed in silence. The three men had diminished in size now until they were no more than 3 inches high. Suddenly the Very Young Man let go of the Big Business Man's arm and looked around to where the Doctor was still leaning pensively against the table leg. The Banker saw him speak swiftly to the Big Business Man, but in so small a voice he could not catch the words. Then both little figures turned towards the table, and the Banker saw the Very Young Man put his hand to his mouth and shout. And upward to him came the shrillest, tiniest little voice he had ever heard, yet a voice still embodying the characteristic intonation of the Very Young Man. "Hey, Doctor," came the words, "you'll never get here if you don't come now." The Doctor looked up abruptly. He evidently heard the words and realized his situation. He was by this time not more than 1.5 inches in height. He hesitated only a moment, and then, as the other two little figures waved their arms wildly, he began running towards them. For more than a minute he ran. The Very Young Man started towards him, but the Doctor waved him back, redoubling his efforts. When he arrived at the edge of the handkerchief, evidently he was nearly winded, for he stopped beside his friends and stood breathing heavily. The Banker leaned forwards and could see the three little figures. They were not as big as the joint of his little finger. Talking earnestly, the Very Young Man was gesticulating wildly, pointing towards the ring. One of them made a start, but the others called him back. Then they began waving their arms, and all at once the Banker realized that they were waving at him. He leaned down, and by their motions knew that something was wrong, that they wanted him to do something. Trembling with fright, the Banker left his chair and knelt upon the floor. The Very Young Man made a funnel of his hands and shouted up, "It's too far away. We can't make it. We're too small." The Banker looked his bewilderment. Then he thought suddenly of the spoon that he still held in his hand, and he put it down towards them. The three little figures ducked and scattered as the spoon in the Banker's trembling fingers neared them. "Not that the ring! Bring it closer! Hurry, hurry!" shouted the Very Young Man. The Banker, leaning closer, could just hear the words. Comprehending at last, he picked up the ring and laid it near the edge of the handkerchief. Immediately the little figures ran over to it and began climbing up. The Very Young Man was the first to reach it. The Banker could see him vault upwards and land astraddle upon its top. The Doctor was up in a moment more, and the two were reaching down their hands to help up the Big Business Man. The Banker slid the spoon carefully along the floor towards the ring, but the Big Business Man waved it away. The Banker laid the spoon aside, and when he looked at the ring again, the Big Business Man was up beside his companions, standing upright with them upon the top of the ring. The Banker stared so long and intently his vision blurred. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again the little figures on the top of the ring had disappeared. The Banker felt suddenly sick and faint in the closeness of the room. Rising to his feet, he hurried to a window and threw up the sash. A gust of rain and wind beat against his face as he stood leaning on the sill. He felt much better after a few moments, and remembering his friends, he closed the window and turned back towards the ring. At first he thought he could just make them out, but when he got down on the floor close beside the ring, he saw nothing. Almost unnerved, he sat down heavily upon the floor beside the handkerchief, leaning on one elbow. A corner of the handkerchief was turned back, and one side was ruffled where the wind from the opened window had blown it up. He smoothed out the handkerchief carefully. For some time the Banker sat quiet, reclining uncomfortably upon the hard floor. The room was very still. Its silence oppressed him. He stared stolidly at the ring, his head in a turmoil. The ring looked oddly out of place, lying over near one edge of the handkerchief. He had always seen it in the center before. Abruptly he put out his hand and picked it up. Then remembrance of the doctor's warning flooded over him. In sudden panic he put the ring down again, almost in the same place, at the edge of the handkerchief. Trembling all over, he looked at his watch. It was 9:15. He rose stiffly to his feet and sank into his chair. After a moment he lighted a cigar. The handkerchief lay at his feet. He could just see the ring over the edge of his knees. For a long time he sat staring. The striking of a church clock near by roused him. He shook himself together and blinked at the empty room. In his hand he held an unlighted cigar. Mechanically he raised it to his lips. The sound of the church bells died away. The silence of the room and the loneliness of it made him shiver. He looked at his watch again. 10 o'clock. Still another hour to wait and watch, and then he could take the ring back to the museum. He glanced down at the ring. It was still lying by the edge of the handkerchief. Again the Banker fell into a stupor as he stared at the glistening gold band lying on the floor at his feet. How lonely he felt! Yet he was not alone, he told himself. His three friends were still there, hardly 2 feet from the toe of his shoe. He wondered how they were making out. Would they come back any moment? Would they ever come back? And then the Banker found himself worrying because the ring was not in the center of the handkerchief. He felt frightened, and he wondered why. Again he looked at his watch. They had been gone more than 2 hours now. Swiftly he stooped, and lifting the ring, gazed at it searchingly, holding it very close to his eyes. Then he carefully put it down in the center of the handkerchief, and lay back in his chair with a long sigh of relief. It was all right now. Just a little while to wait, and then he could take it back to the museum. In a moment his eyes blinked, closed, and soon he was fast asleep, lying sprawled out in the big leather chair and breathing heavily. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Perilous Ways. The Very Young Man sat on the floor between his two friends at the edge of the handkerchief and put the first pellets of the drug to his tongue. His heart was beating furiously. His forehead was damp with the sweat of excitement and of fear. The pellets tasted sweet and yet a little acrid. He crushed them in his mouth and swallowed them hastily. In the silence of the room the ticking of his watch suddenly sounded very loud. He raised his arm and looked at its face. It was just 10 minutes past 8. He continued to stare at its dial, wondering why nothing was happening to him. Then all at once the figures on the watch became very sharp and vivid. He could see them with microscopic clearness. A buzzing sounded in his ears. He remembered having felt the same way just before he fainted. He drew a deep breath and looked around the room. It swam before his gaze. He closed his eyes and waited, wondering if he would faint. The buzzing in his head grew louder. A feeling of nausea possessed him. After a moment his head cleared. He felt better. Then, all at once, he realized that the floor upon which he sat was moving. It seemed to be shifting out from under him in all directions. He sat with his feet flat upon the floor, his knees drawn close against his chin. And the floor
seemed to be carrying his feet farther out. He constantly had to be pulling them back against him. He put one hand down beside him and could feel his fingers dragging very slowly as the polished surface moved past. The noise in his head was almost gone now. He opened his eyes. Before him, across the handkerchief, the Banker sat in his chair. He had grown enormously in size, and as the Very Young Man looked, he could see him and the chair growing steadily larger. He met the Banker's anxious glance and smiled up at him. Then he looked at his two friends sitting on the floor beside him. They alone, of everything within his range of vision, had grown no larger. The Very Young Man thought of the belt around his waist. He put his hand to it and found it tight as before. So, after all, they would not have to leave anything behind, he thought. The Doctor rose to his feet and turned away, back under the huge table that loomed up behind him. The Very Young Man got up too, and stood beside the Big Business Man, holding to him for support. His head felt strangely confused, and his legs were weak and shaky. Steadily larger grew the room and everything in it. The Very Young Man turned his eyes up to the light high overhead. Its great electric bulbs dazzled him with their brilliancy. Its powerful glare made objects around as bright as though in daylight. After a moment the Big Business Man's grip on his arm tightened. "God, it's weird," he said in a tense whisper. "Look." Before them spread a great, level, shining expanse of black, with the ring in its center, a huge golden circle. Beyond the farther edge of the black they could see the feet of the Banker and the lower part of his legs stretching into the air far above them. The Very Young Man looked up still higher and saw the Banker staring down at him. "Good bye, my boy," said the Banker. His voice came from far away in a great roar to the Very Young Man's ears. "Good bye, sir," said the Very Young Man, and waved his hand. Several minutes passed, and still the Very Young Man stood holding to his companion, and watching the expanse of handkerchief widening out and the gleaming ring growing larger. Then he thought of the Doctor, and turned suddenly to look behind him. Across the wide, glistening surface of the floor stood the Doctor, leaning against a tremendous column that the Very Young Man knew was the leg of the center table. And as the Very Young Man stood staring, he could see this distance between them growing steadily greater. A sudden fear possessed him, and he shouted to his friend. "Good Lord, suppose he can't make it," said the Big Business Man fearfully. "He's coming," answered the Very Young Man. "He's got to make it." The Doctor was running towards them now, and in a few moments he was beside them, breathing heavily. "Close call, Frank," said the Big Business Man, shaking his head. "You are the one said we must keep together." The Doctor was too much out of breath to answer. "This is worse," said the Very Young Man. "Look where the ring is." More than 200 yards away, across the black expanse of silk handkerchief, lay the ring. "It's almost as high as our waist now, and look how far it is," added the Very Young Man excitedly. "It's getting farther every minute," said the Big Business Man. "Come on." He started to run towards the ring. "I can't make it. It's too far," shouted the Doctor after him. The Big Business Man stopped short. "What do we do?" he asked. "We've got to get there." "That ring will be a mile away in a few minutes at the rate it's going," said the Very Young Man. "We'll have to get him to move it over here," decided the Doctor, looking up into the air and pointing. "Gee, I never thought of that," said the Very Young Man. "Oh, great Scott, look at him!" Out across the broad expanse of handkerchief they could see the huge white face of their friend looming 400 or 500 feet in the air above them. It was the most astounding sight their eyes had ever beheld. Yet so confused were they by the flood of new impressions to which they were being subjected that this colossal figure added little to their surprise. "We must make him move the ring over here," repeated the Doctor. "You'll never make him hear you," said the Big Business Man, as the Very Young Man began shouting at the top of his voice. "We've got to," said the Very Young Man breathlessly. "Look at that ring. We can't get to it now. We're stranded here. Good Lord, what's the matter with him? Can't he see us?" he added, and began shouting again. "He's getting up," said the Doctor. They could see the figure of the banker towering in the air 1,000 feet above the ring, and then with a swoop of his enormous face come down to them as he knelt upon the floor. With his hands to his mouth, the Very Young Man shouted up, "It's too far away. We can't make it. We're too small." They waited. Suddenly, without warning, a great wooden oval bowl 15 or 20 feet across came at them with tremendous speed. They scattered hastily in terror. "Not that! The ring!" shouted the Very Young Man as he realized it was the spoon in the banker's hand that had frightened them. A moment more and the ring was before them, lying at the edge of the handkerchief, a circular pit of rough yellow rock breast high. They ran over to it and climbed upon its top. Another minute and the ring had grown until its top became a narrow curving path upon which they could stand. They got upon their feet and looked around curiously. "Well, we're here," remarked the Very Young Man. "Everything's okay so far. Let's get right around after that scratch." "Keep together," cautioned the Doctor, and they started off along the path, following its inner edge. As they progressed, the top of the ring steadily became broader, the surface underfoot became rougher. The Big Business Man, walking nearest the edge, pulled his companion toward him. "Look there," he said. They stood cautiously at the edge and looked down. Beneath them the ring bulged out. Over the bulge they could see the black of the handkerchief, a sheer 100-foot drop. The ring curved sharply to the left. They could follow its wall all the way around. It formed a circular pit some 250 feet in diameter. A gentle breeze fanned their faces as they walked. The Very Young Man looked up into the gray of the distance overhead. A little behind, over his shoulder, he saw above him in the sky a great gleaming light many times brighter than the sun. It cast on the ground before him an opaque shadow, blurred about the edges. "Pretty good day at that," remarked the Very Young Man, throwing out his chest. The Doctor laughed. "It's 8:30 at night," he said, "and if you'll remember, half an hour ago, it's a very stormy night, too." The Big Business Man stopped short in his walk. "Just think," he said, pointing up into the gray of the sky with a note of awe in his voice. "Over there, not more than 15 feet away, is a window looking down towards the Gaiety Theater and Broadway." The Very Young Man looked bewildered. "That window's 100 miles away," he said positively. 15 feet," said the Big Business Man, "just beyond the table." "It's all in the viewpoint," said the Doctor, and laughed again. They had recovered their spirits by now, the Very Young Man especially seeming imbued with the enthusiasm of adventure. The path became constantly rougher as they advanced. The ground underfoot, a shaggy yellow metallic ore, was strewn now with pebbles. The pebbles grew larger farther on, becoming huge rocks and boulders that greatly impeded their progress. They soon found it difficult to follow the brink of the precipice. The path had broadened now so that its outer edge was out of sight, for they could see only a short distance amid the boulders that everywhere tumbled about, and after a time they found themselves wandering along, lost in the barren waste. "How far is the scratch, do you suppose?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. They stopped and consulted a moment. Then the Very Young Man clambered up to the top of a rock. "There's a range of hills over there, pretty close," he called down to them. "That must be the way." They had just started again in the direction of the hills when, almost without warning, and with a great whistle and roar, a gale of wind swept down upon them. They stood still and looked at each other with startled faces, bracing with their feet against its pressure. "Oh, golly, what's this?" cried the Very Young Man, and sat down suddenly upon the ground to keep from being blown forward. The wind increased rapidly in violence until, in a moment, all three of the men were crouching upon the ground for shelter. "Great Scott, this is a tornado!" ejaculated the Big Business Man. His words were almost lost amid the howling of the blast as it swept across the barren waste of rocks. "Roger never told us anything about this. It's getting worse every minute. I—" A shower of pebbles and a great cloud of metallic dust swept past, leaving them choking and gasping for breath. The Very Young Man got upon his hands and knees. "I'm going over there," he panted. "It's better." End of chapter 13. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Strange Experiences. Led by the Very Young Man, the three crawled a few yards to where a cluster of boulders promised better shelter. Huddled behind this mass of rock, they found themselves protected in a measure from the violence of the storm. Lying there, they could see yellowish gray clouds of sand go sweeping by, with occasionally a hail of tiny pebbles, blowing almost horizontal. Overhead the sky was unchanged. Not a vestige of cloud was visible, only the gray blue of an immense distance, with the huge gleaming light, like an enormous sun, hung in its center. The Very Young Man put his hand on the Doctor's arm. "It's going down," he said. Hardly were the words out of his mouth before, with even less warning than it began, the gale abruptly ceased. There remained only the pleasantly gentle breeze of a summer afternoon blowing against their faces, and this came from almost an opposite direction to the storm. The three men looked at one another in amazement. "Well, I'll be!" ejaculated the Very Young Man. "What next?" They waited for some time, afraid to venture out from the rocks among which they had taken refuge. They decided that the storm, however unexplainable, was over for the time at least. They climbed to their feet and resumed their journey with bruised knees, but otherwise none the worse for the danger through which they had passed. After walking a short distance, they came up a little incline, and before them, hardly more than a quarter of a mile away, they could see a range of hills. "That scratch must be behind those hills," said the Very Young Man, pointing. "It's a long distance," said the Big Business Man thoughtfully. "We're still growing smaller. Look." Their minds had been so occupied that for some time they had forgotten the effect of the drug upon their stature. As they looked about them now, they could see the rocks around them still increasing steadily in size, and could feel the ground shifting under their feet when they stood still. "You're right, we're getting smaller," observed the Very Young Man. "How long before we'll stop, do you suppose?" The Doctor drew the Chemist's memoranda from the pouch of his belt. "It says about 5 or 6 hours for the first 4 pellets," he read. The Very Young Man looked at his watch. "Quarter to 9. We've been less than an hour yet. Come on, let's keep going," and he started walking rapidly forward. They walked for a time in silence. The line of hills before them grew visibly in size, and they seemed slowly to be nearing it. "I've been thinking," began the Doctor thoughtfully, as he glanced up at the hills. "There's one theory of Roger's that was a fallacy. You remember he was quite positive that this change of stature became steadily more rapid until it reached its maximum rate and then remained constant. If that were so, we should probably be diminishing in size more rapidly now than when we first climbed on to the ring. If we had so much trouble getting into the ring then," he smiled at the remembrance of their difficulty, I don't see how we could ever get to those hills now." "Gee, that's so," said the Very Young Man. "We'd never be able to get anywhere, would we?" "How do you figure it works?" asked the Big Business Man. The Doctor folded up the paper and replaced it in his belt. "I don't know," he answered. "I think probably it proceeds in cycles, like the normal rate of growth times of rapid progress succeeded by periods of comparative inactivity." "I never knew people grew that way," observed the Very Young Man. "They do," said the Doctor. "And if the drugs produce the same effect, we " He got no further, for suddenly the earth seemed to rise swiftly under them, and they were thrown violently to the ground. The Very Young Man, as he lay prone, looked upward and saw the sunlike light above fall swiftly down across the sky and disappear below the horizon, plunging the world about them into the gloom of a semi twilight. A wind, fiercer than before, swept over them with a roar. "The end of the world," murmured the Very Young Man to himself, and he wondered why he was not frightened. Then came the feeling of an extraordinary lightness of body, as though the ground were dropping away from under him. The wind abruptly ceased blowing. He saw the ball of light rise swiftly from the horizon and mount upward in a great, gleaming arc to the zenith, where again it hung motionless. The three men lay quiet, their heads reeling. Then the Very Young Man sat up dizzily and began feeling himself all over. "There's nothing wrong with me," he said lugubriously, meeting the eyes of his friends, who apparently were also more surprised than hurt. "But oh my gosh, the whole universe went nutty," he added to himself in awe. "What did that?" asked the Big Business Man. He climbed unsteadily to his feet and sat upon a rock, holding his head in his hands. The Doctor was up in a moment beside him. "We're not hurt," he said, looking at his companions. "Don't let's waste any more time. Let's get into that valley." The Very Young Man could see by his manner that he knew or guessed what had happened. "But say, what " began the Very Young Man. "Come on," interrupted the Doctor, and started walking ahead swiftly. There was nothing for his two friends to do but to follow. They walked in silence, in single file, picking their way among the rocks. For a quarter of an hour or more they kept going, until finally they came to the ridge of hills, finding them enormous rocks several hundred feet high, strewn closely together. "The valley must be right beyond," said the Doctor. "Come on." The spaces between these huge rocks were, some of them, 50 feet or more in width. Inside the hills the travelers found the ground even rougher than before, and it was nearly half an hour before they emerged on the other side. Instead of the shallow valley they expected to find, they came upon a precipice, a sheer drop into a tremendous canyon, half as wide possibly as it was deep. They could see down to its bottom from where they stood, the same rocky, barren waste as that through which they had been traveling. Across the canyon, on the farther side, lay another line of hills. "It's the scratch, all right," said the Very Young Man, as they stopped near the brink of the precipice. "But holy smokes, isn't it big!" "That's 2,000 feet down there," said the Big Business Man, stepping cautiously nearer to the edge. "Roger didn't say it was so deep." "That's because we've been so much longer getting here," explained the Doctor. "How are we going to get down?" asked the Very Young Man, as he stood beside the Big Business Man within a few feet of the brink. "It's getting deeper every minute. Don't forget that." The Big Business Man knelt down and carefully approached to the very edge of the precipice. Then, as he looked over, he got upon his feet with a laugh of relief. "Come here," he said. They joined him at the edge, and looking over, could see that the jagged roughness of the wall made the descent, though difficult, not exceptionally hazardous. Below them, not more than 20 feet, a wide ledge jutted out, and beyond that they could see other similar ledges and crevices that would afford a foothold. "We can get down that," said the Very Young Man. "There's an easy place," and he pointed further along the brink to where a break in the edge seemed to offer a means of descent to the ledge just below. "It's going to be a mighty long climb down," said the Big Business Man, "especially as we're getting smaller all the time. I wonder," he added thoughtfully, "how it would be if we made ourselves larger before we started. We could get big enough, you know, so that it would only be a few hundred feet down there. Then, after we got down, we could get small again." "That's a thought," said the Very Young Man. The Doctor sat down somewhat wearily and again took the papers from his belt. "The idea is a good one," he said, "but there's one thing you overlook. The larger we get, the smoother the wall is going to be. Look, can't you see it changing every moment?" It was true. Even in the short time since they had first looked down, new crevices had opened up. The descent, though longer, was momentarily becoming less dangerous. "You see," continued the Doctor, "if the valley were only a few hundred feet deep, the precipice might then be so sheer we could not trust ourselves to it at all." "You're right," observed the Big Business Man. "Well, it's not very hard to get down now," said the Very Young Man. "Let's get going before it gets any deeper. Say," he added, "how about stopping our size where it is? How would that work?" The Doctor was reading the papers he held in his hand. "I think," he said, "it would be our wisest course to follow as closely as possible what Rogers tells us to do. It may be harder, but I think we will avoid trouble in the end." "We could get lost in size just as easily as in space, couldn't we?" the Big Business Man put in. "That's a curious idea, isn't it?" "It's true," agreed the Doctor. "It is something we must guard against very carefully." "Well, come on then, let's get going," said the Very Young Man, pulling the Doctor to his feet. The Big Business Man glanced at his watch. 20 to 10, he said. Then he looked up into the sky. "1 hour and a half ago," he added sentimentally, "we were up there. What will another hour bring, I wonder?" "Nothing at all," said the Very Young Man, "if we don't get started. Come on." He walked toward the place he had selected, followed by his companions, and thus the three adventurers began their descent into the ring. Chapter 15